It's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and thank you for all sitting through the presentations this morning. Our normal disclaimer here, and just moving straight into the detail. So Amplia is developing a pipeline of drugs that inhibit a protein called FAK, focal adhesion kinase, very much like the JAK kinases that I worked on previously. There are two other drugs in clinical development that target FAK. We believe from all the data that we've looked at, our own data and clinical data, that ours is best in class. Our lead project is in pancreatic cancer, and particularly metastatic pancreatic cancer. And as shown on this slide, and I'll talk a little bit more, we've had some really promising data from our clinical study in pancreatic cancer. And we're now well underway in a registrational study planning, and indeed have started the first phase of that registrational study. We've also recently announced a program in ovarian cancer, another cancer where there's high FAK involvement, and that's in conjunction with the leading not-for-profit in that space called the Australian New Zealand Gynecology Oncology Group, ANZGOG. I'll talk a bit more about that. And then lastly, and I think really exciting for us, is this new area that's really developed in the last few years called KRAS inhibitors. These are drugs that have been targeted to a mutant protein, for a long time thought undruggable. There's now companies like Revolution Medicines, a market capitalization of $40 billion US. That's with billion with a B. Erasca, a company with a drug in phase 1, their market cap is $5 billion. Again, just because they're targeting a protein that no one's been able to target before. Problem with KRAS inhibitors is they don't work perfectly. We believe our FAK inhibitor can be added to those KRAS inhibitors to really ramp up their activity, to amplify their activity. So I'll talk a bit more about that. And that's a really growing area and something we're really excited about. So how does a FAK inhibitor work? Well, it has really two key features. One of them, it affects what happens around the tumour tissue. So I talk about solid tumours here, where you have a scar tissue that forms in response to the tumour growth. And that scar tissue really acts as a kind of barrier, a shield, so that your immune system can't get in. And even if you add drugs, they can't penetrate the fibrous tissue. And so a FAK inhibitor, our drug, can actually break down that fibrous tissue so that you get better penetration of drugs into the tumour tissue. And we've just uploaded a publication that we did here with a group at the Garvan Institute, and that's available online now, that really delves into the deep science behind that. So first of all, break apart that fibrous tissue. The second thing we do actually with the FAK inhibitor is we actually block the pathways that the tumour cells use to get around the effects of chemotherapy. We all know that chemotherapy can work for a bit and then it stops working. Well, often those resistance pathways involve the FAK enzyme, and we can turn that off. So we think that combination, that 1-2 punch, if you like, is a real opportunity to benefit the activity of other drugs, hence Amplify, and the name of the company really reflecting that. We're amplifying the effects of other drugs with our drug. So let me talk about the data from our ACCENT study. This is a study that we've been running for the last 3 years. It's very, very much coming to the end. We've shown that our drug is very well tolerated by patients, and we've got some really exciting data. And just to explain how the drug works, patients who are newly diagnosed with metastatic pancreatic cancer, that's about, well, it's more than half, probably about 60 to 70% of patients are diagnosed at the metastatic disease, where it's spread to other parts of the body. They would get standard of care chemotherapy, which consists in Australia of 2 drugs called gemcitabine and Abraxane that are given 3 times every 4 weeks. Given IV, as shown there. On top of that, we're asking patients to take our drug, which is a pill, so very convenient for patients, no expense to have to go into hospital and occupy a chair to take our drug. They just take it as a pill, and they take it in the days preceding their chemotherapy. The idea here is they take it, the tumour, scar tissue dissolves, they then take the chemotherapy, gets into the drug and gets into the tumours and works better. Very simplistic sort of approach. What we saw is, and I'll just take you through these numbers from left to right. So first of all, we saw 5 complete responders out of 64 patients. So that's 5 patients where the tumour totally disappeared when you looked at their CT scans every 2 months. So that's pretty much unprecedented. We modelled our whole study on the MPACT study, which was published about 10 years ago. They had 1 complete response out of 430 patients. So we've had 5 out of 64 patients. So that level of response rate is unprecedented in this disease. So that's the first thing to note. We also had another patient who had a partial response who then went on, left the trial. They surgically went in because they could still see a bit of tumour, but he was doing so well, they thought something's not right. Went in, took out that tumour. In fact, it was just dead tissue. So that was a pathological complete response. So if you include that patient, it's essentially 6 out of 64 patients had a complete response. We had disease control rate, which is another definition. You sort of wrap up all the types of responders, which compares very favourably to the 50%. So 70% in our trial, 50% in the standard chemotherapy alone. A median overall survival of 11.1 months. So that compares to chemotherapy alone of somewhere between 8 and 9 months. Now that mightn't sound like a lot, but if you're looking down the barrel of being dead in 8 months, an extra 2 months actually is very meaningful. It's also meaningful for the regulators. The last drug to be approved in pancreatic cancer was approved actually on an 11.1 month overall survival compared to gemcitabine Abraxane. And lastly, and most importantly, that when patients take our drug, they don't feel any worse. They're already dealing with chemotherapy, they're dealing with the disease. We're not actually adding any additional burden to those patients when they take our drug. So really very promising data from the ACCENT study. And based on that, we're now well into planning for our registrational pathway, which is really a 3-stage process. This is in discussion and we've had a number of discussions and continue to do so with the US Food and Drug Administration. The first part of that 3-stage process we've already started. We'll start recruiting patients in the next couple of months. So that's called the ACCENT mini trial. That's where we're looking at changing from an intermittent dosing of our drug to daily dosing. We believe, 1, it's easier for patients, and 2, we'll get better, even better responses. And then we've got this regulatory process that we're working with the FDA just to refine the protocol. But that's definitely ongoing, and the intention is we would start that registrational phase in the second half of next year. Touch briefly on our work in ovarian cancer, which is an area of high unmet need as well. And indeed, we've got, as I mentioned before, ANZCOG as a partner. They're like the top group you could work with in Australia. All the best clinicians are in ANZCOG. Just a couple of statistics, 70% of patients with ovarian cancer, much like in pancreatic cancer, are diagnosed at an advanced stage of disease. The typical treatment is you get chemotherapy, then you will get surgery. So the chemotherapy shrinks the tumour, you then get surgery to remove the tumour. Unfortunately, about 20% of patients don't respond to that initial chemotherapy. And the current treatment is, we'll give you more chemotherapy in this sort of vain hope that the chemotherapy is going to start working. This is, we think, a really exciting opportunity because we believe, based on our preclinical work, that our drug will make the chemotherapy work better in these particular unresponsive patients. Again, there's a lot of fibrosis, scar tissue in ovarian cancer. So as I've said here, patients will be identified who are not responding to the initial chemotherapy. They'll come onto our study. They'll get our drug plus the same chemotherapy as before. And then we'll be monitoring how many more patients we can bring to that point where they can undergo the debulking surgery, removal of the tumour. So that study should recruit patients. I was hoping to have a patient recruited by the end of this month. That's been delayed slightly with some just paperwork essentially, but we're planning to dose patients in the next month or so. And then lastly, I wanted to finish up in the last few minutes I've got about this field of KRAS inhibitors, which, as I said, is a really exciting development. If you look up that now in the literature, you'll be, or just on Google, you'll see that there's a huge activity around the world in KRAS inhibitors. We think that's a real opportunity for our FAK inhibitors because we know they will make them work better, deeper responses, and they'll block the resistance processes. So a little bit of background. KRAS mutations are present in a whole range of tumours. Pancreatic cancer, a cancer we know well. Colorectal cancer, which we heard about from Beck this morning. Lung cancer, very big markets. And we think that our FAK inhibitor can really come along for the ride that's going on here at the moment. There's over 60 KRAS inhibitors in clinical development. Biotechs that you might never have heard of, Big Pharma, all Big Pharma have at least one KRAS inhibitor in clinical development. Some have multiple. And we see this as a market, and those figures are from the literature, but I expect the market is going to grow even larger. This is a little bit of science, but basically you can see the sort of RAS pathway on the left. That's the one that's hyperactivated in these KRAS mutated cells. And that's driving proliferative signalling, making the cancer cells grow and proliferate. When you block that pathway, they rewire, and often rewire through that FAK pathway, which also is a proliferative pathway. So by blocking both arms of that proliferative signalling, you get a better outcome. And indeed, that's not just some fancy academic insight. There's now clinical data showing that. Verastem, one of our competitors, they've got an approved drug that works exactly by this. It blocks both the RAS pathway and the FAK pathway. It's two drugs given together for a very rare form of ovarian cancer. There's our other competitor is a Chinese company, Inxmed. They've just published early data. It's a Chinese study only, 30 patients, but again, they've shown that the RAS plus FAK combination gives you a better outcome. And we've got a lot of preclinical data supporting that as well. So this is our pipeline. We've got the ACCENT study that's just coming to an end now. We've had another patient just very recently complete 2 years on the study. So 2 patients have now been on study for more than 24 months. Again, the normal survival in metastatic disease with chemotherapy would be about 8 months. So they've gone out to 24 months. So we've still got some patients on study. We've got FDA meetings planned over the next few months. We're starting the ACCENT mini trial. As I said, hope to recruit patients shortly. And in the background, we've got the PROSE study. In addition, we are talking to a number of KRAS inhibitor developers. We think, we know there's this resistance process and there's a lot of companies that are very interested in our data and the opportunity here about combinations. So I hope to be able to present in the not too distant future some further developments in that space. And now, lastly, you could even consider, since KRAS inhibitors are being developed in pancreatic cancer, of combining a KRAS inhibitor into our registrational study. So that's something we're talking to providers and the FDA about as well. So I'll just finish off a little bit of, this is a couple of days old. We've just actually put out our 4C today, so we've got now $24 million in the bank. That gets us well into 2027. Our share price is sitting at about 14 cents. We think that's travesty. But anyhow, a lot of biotech investment funds are on the register. Very experienced board. Big pharma experience, drug development experience, and 3 of the 5 board members have taken drugs all the way through to approval. So you won't see that with many management teams. With that, I'm going to leave you. I'll just leave you with this image. A high jumper can only jump so high. If you grab a pole, you can jump higher. And we're like the pole. We make drugs work better. So thank you very much.